Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Good evening and welcome to Beyond Resistance. Institutional Church Meets the Postmodern World by Reverend John Dorhauer, Lynn Wasilewski, and myself, Kim Paré, are on chapter 5. So we're just going to jump right in when Lynn's going to take us to the next chapter.
Great. Hi, everybody. I hope you're all having a good evening so far. I'm going to begin reading chapter 5 in Beyond Resistance. And if you're following along in your own book, we're on page 75. It's entitled Postmodernity and Authority, and it opens with a quote by Laurie Seidler. I strive to be kind, but not because I was told to. There are two sides to the same coin we know as authorized professional clergy, authority, and authorization. Authority in ministry. On the first side of that coin, authority, there is a presumption that a trained professional who has been prepared and examined is granted permission to speak and act on behalf of the church. Any church that extends a call to this professional will give her a venue in which, on matters of faith and spirituality, she'll be expected to serve as an authority. In some of our faith traditions, she will be the sole arbiter of matters ecclesiastical and spiritual. In other traditions, she will be one among many. Even here, though, it will be conceded that her power will often trump all others. This is what authority means. She will speak with the weight of the church at her disposal. For some, she will speak as with the voice of God. Pastors are given this kind of authority. I remember two very cute stories from the time I was serving as a pastor in my first church. Little Timmy Wright was born just a few months before I moved from seminary to begin my ministry in Mayview, Missouri. When he was about 3 years old, he was sitting in church one Sunday morning next to his mother. The way the sanctuary was built, the pastor's chair was placed directly behind the pulpit. When I was sitting there, I was hidden by it. After my sermon that morning, as the offering was being collected, I sat in that chair to listen to the music being played by our organist. That's when Timmy looked up and saw that I had disappeared. He turned to his mom, looked up at her and asked, "Mom, where did God go?" Cute story. Number 2 is similar. Philip Wagner was born a few years into my ministry at Mayview. He was adorable. My second son, Adam, was 2 years old when we moved there. By the time Timmy was born, Adam had outgrown his very first Cardinal baseball hat. Because this church was about 40 miles east of Kansas City, most of the members were KC Royal fans. We had a running feud going through my 8 years there about that. I was a diehard Cardinal fan. Because of that running feud, rather than just get rid of the hat that Adam had outgrown, one morning I gave the hat to little Timmy. 2 weeks later, his mom came up to me and said with some irritation in her voice, "I wish to God you had never given him that stupid hat." I smiled, thinking that this was her way of keeping the feud going. She was upset that my plot to turn him into a Cardinal fan was working. Turns out it wasn't that at all. She went on to say, when he takes a bath, when he sits down to eat, when he goes to bed, I tell him the same thing. "Timmy, you have to take that hat off now." He won't. I try to take it off and he just insists on putting it back on his head. He refuses to ever take it off. When I asked him why, he just looked at me and said, "Mommy, Jesus gave this to me." I need to tell one more story while I'm making this point about authority. It's not a cute story. It's terribly sad. Lori was a 24-year-old bride who was deeply in love with her husband. He was 32. She and her family were pillars of that church in Mayview. Her smile was infectious and never left her face. She was just a delight to be around. She and her husband had just moved into their new dream home. Life was good, very good. I went to this church right out of seminary. It was a small church in a small town. Mayview's population was around 260 people. It was 10 miles from a gallon of gas and a loaf of bread. I went my first year without a member of the church dying, so I hadn't yet done my first funeral when, a little past my first anniversary at the church, the phone rang. It was a Saturday morning and my wife was at work. She was a nurse. I was at home working on my sermon and watching our 3 young children. I picked up the phone and heard a woman asking me if I was Pastor John, and I said yes. She told me that a member of my church had just died. His wife was here at the hospital. She was hysterical and could not be calmed down. Could I come and help? I told her of course I would, and I asked who it was. She told me she didn't know. The man who had died had no ID on him, and they had been trying for some time to calm her down and get some information from her, but couldn't. I said I would be there right away and hung up the phone. One of the families from church was outside cutting the church's lawn, so I went and asked them to watch the kids and then took off. I'll be honest, I was scared. It was my first death of a church member. I thought to myself, what do I do when I get there? What can I possibly say to this woman who is so hysterical she can't give her name to a nurse? I felt totally unprepared. I felt useless. I knew who I was and I knew what she needed, and I didn't think I was very well equipped for this at all. I was struggling with that and even wondering if I hadn't made a terrible mistake going into ministry. I was sure of what she needed and deserved, and I doubted that I could provide it. I remembered thinking it might help a little if I knew who it was. I replayed the conversation with the nurse over and over for at least a clue that would help me to figure that out. Nothing. I really almost pulled the car over and turned it around thinking, I just can't do this. Then it hit me. How did that nurse know to call me? I mean, here I was struggling to figure out who I was about to go visit, this unknown woman so overcome with grief that she can't give her own name to the nurse. How did the nurse know to call me? Did she just randomly pick up the phone and start calling churches in a 20-mile radius asking, are you Pastor John? When someone answered? And did she just happen to guess the right church and the right name when I picked up the phone? I knew that wasn't true. She knew exactly who to call, which means that this woman, so torn up with grief, she couldn't give her own name to the nurse, could give my name to the nurse. When this hit me, I did pull the car over. I sat on the side of the road for a brief minute and wrapped my head around it. I thought to myself that whatever you thought this whole ministry thing was about, whatever you thought it meant to these people to be their pastor, you were wrong. This is something very, very different. You better get your stuff together really quickly because this is real. She needs you now, not to be her friend, but her pastor. The rest of the drive was a blur. I got to the hospital. I did not go right in. I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel for a quiet minute or two. I remember having one last conversation with the one who got me into this whole thing in the first place. I said out loud, okay, God, I'm going in there. I have no idea what I'm doing. I thought about quitting on the way over here, but I'm not going to do that. I made you a promise and I'm going to live out my promise to you. But here's the deal. You made me a promise that when I didn't have the words to say, you would provide them. You keep your promises and I'll keep mine. That having been said, I got out of the car, walked into the hospital and found what was there waiting for me. The nurse was not exaggerating. There Lori was. She was a mess. Her grief was palpable. I stayed with her. I went in with her to talk with and say goodbye to her beloved Fred. Over the next few days, I went and sat with her in her grief. I sat with Fred's family and listened to them all pour out their grief. I prepared myself for the funeral that came just a few days later. I went and visited with her after the funeral. Weeks went by. To this day, I have no idea what it was I said to her. I didn't know what mattered or how it mattered. What I do remember, in fact, was that I can never forget that she eventually came back to church one Sunday morning. Instead of going into the sanctuary, she came and met me outside my office. She was crying. She held my face in her hands. She told me she would never have gotten through this without me, and then went and took her seat in the sanctuary. Before I went in to lead worship, I sat in my office. I told myself two things. One, you learned you can do this. Hold your head up and don't doubt that God walks with you. Two, stop playing. This pastor stuff is serious business. Whatever you thought these people needed you to be, you were wrong. Now you know. Get it together. Mayview was my training ground. I was there 8 years with some of the most beautiful people you could imagine. They loved me into ministry. It was they who taught me what it meant to be a pastor. It was there I learned about the power of pastoral authority. Timmy Wright's and Philip Wagner's stories were cute, but something deeply serious hit me later after their mothers told me those cute stories. These precious little children think of me as God or Jesus. That's some heavy stuff, I had to tell myself. Don't you dare take what you are to them lightly, and don't you dare do anything to abuse or betray this trust that they have given you. What happened to Lori and what she needed from her church and her pastor was my first great lesson in understanding what being a pastor means. Only after that did it dawn on me what kind of authority we are given and what it can be used to do. Authorization in ministry. On the second side of this coin, we call ministry is authorization. There is an assumption that every professional clergy person who functions within the life of the church does so with the permission and oversight of some other person or body. Often, this process of authorization will include years of master's level education at considerable expense, a battery of psychological examinations, oral examinations by various interested and invested constituencies, from local churches to seminaries to adjudicatory bodies to ecclesiastical councils, interviews by a local church or calling body prior to employment, and finally, continued oversight after ordination by a body equipped and trained to test whether or not the authorized professional clergy person remains fit for ministry in and on behalf of the denomination in which she serves. I belong to the United Church of Christ. I am a conference minister, which doesn't mean a whole lot to anyone outside the denomination. I often just tell people to think of me as a bishop. The analogy works to a point. The more subtle truth is that our bishop is a team of 12 people, well balanced with lay and clergy. They are called our Committee on Church and Ministry. They serve for 6 years. Together, they examine every candidate for ministry, determining on behalf of the entire church whether or not they are fit to serve in and on behalf of the denomination. Theirs is an onerous yet noble task. The work of oversight doesn't end with a pastor's ordination. Every clergy who holds standing in our conference is subject to the oversight of these 12 people. For the last 11 years, I have staffed these committees on the 2 conferences I have served. Before that, I spent the previous 6 years serving on and eventually chairing one of the Missouri committees. At my very first meeting as a young pastor on the committee in Missouri, we heard a complaint about inappropriate sexual activity on the part of one of our pastors working with youth at our church camp. Since that time, almost 18 years ago, there have been very few times when I have not been processing a complaint about one of our pastors. I have processed complaints about clergy sexually abusing their grandchildren, traumatizing their staff because they could not manage their anger, extorting funds from their members, counseling a husband while the clergy was sleeping with the man's wife, plagiarizing ordination papers using stories shared by members in counseling sessions as sermon illustrations, and so much more. Clergy have authority. There is never any question about that. Those with authority to serve in the name of the church also have authorization. This means that the authority derives from somewhere other than the clergy person themselves. It means that once authority is granted, those who function with that authority will place themselves under the oversight of the authorizing body. It can be no other way. Even independent churches with pastors who function with a great deal of authority have some way of holding that pastor accountable. In a nutshell, authority and authorization serve as fundamental elements of ministry. They are crucial to our current understanding of what it means to be part of the professional clergy of the church. Before I write any more about this dynamic and how it all may be shifting, I want to add something very crucial to this discussion. It can be easily misunderstood that the church as we know it has become top-heavy. Postmodernity, as we have already discussed, does not value established authority and hierarchy. It may be more accurate to say, quite simply, that they don't trust it. They believe the adage that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Because of that, many who critique the church accuse it of being too heavily invested in hierarchy. They see power structures and the people who occupy positions of power and authority as corrupt. They see the structures, rubrics, and processes that govern authorization and oversight as hurdles to be jumped over, hoops to jump through, in order to satisfy some arbitrary whim that those in power establish. They also see those with oversight as some sort of watchful eye to live in fear of. They are constantly watching, waiting for you to slip up so that they can strip you of your authority. When the church acts with the authority it is given, when it uses the power it is afforded, there is often someone or someones on the other side of that use of power who resist or resent it. This can happen when a pastor vetoes the actions of the local church board or preaches a sermon that makes the members feel uncomfortable. This can happen when a seminary student who is examined by an ordination committee is deemed not fit for ministry. This can happen when a local church pastor is stripped of her standing following a substantial violation of her ordination vows or the ethical code of ministerial conduct. This can happen when a bishop closes or sells a church. Hierarchy, power, and authority have become pejorative terms in the postmodern mind. This is what I want to make clear. No power is given, blessed, held, or maintained in the church unless the body politic, as a collective whole, believes it exists for the common good. Even in denominations with an episcopal polity, with clearly centralized lines of power and authority located in one person, existing structures are maintained because and when the collective will of the people believes that this is the best way to protect and preserve the integrity of the church. I am a judicatory officer because I believe that the structure the church has built is a means by which people of faith can be assured that those whom we authorize to serve them are safe, competent, trustworthy. I feel the need to say unequivocally before I write about the postmodern's relationship to power and authority and what that might mean for how they come to build something to sustain their faith. All denominations that seek to serve the gospel have their orthodoxies, including those with more congregational polity. All denominations have certain standards of belief and practices that must be preserved. I happen to serve in a denomination that prides itself on its openness, and we require all candidates for authorized ministry to meet some pretty high standards that can only come after years of preparation. Demonstrating a requisite understanding of who we are, from where we came, and what our core values are is essential. These orthodoxies exist to preserve an aspect of the gospel seen as essential to a church or a denomination's way of being. All who serve in the name of Jesus must also serve people. The sick and dying will be visited. The anxious and the grieving will be counseled. The lonely and the distraught will be comforted. Those who are authorized will be given almost unlimited access to people at their most vulnerable moments. I don't know of any other profession that has this access. Doctors will learn things about the sick that no one else knows, no one else will get to know. Lawyers will be entrusted with information that no one else hears. Counselors and therapists will hear the storied details of our lives that we don't share with anyone else. It is entirely likely that a clergy person will hear all of that. I often remind our oversight committees that when they examine a candidate for ministry, they should keep in mind the first order of the Hippocratic Oath, do not harm. I ask them to test whether or not the person they are examining for ordination is one who they believe will do no harm. Because they will be given unfettered access to people at their most vulnerable, the potential for real damage to real people is always present. Great care and caution must be taken for the sake of those beautiful and often fragile people. Because of the authority invested in the clergy by the church, their words and actions are so very powerful. In order to preserve its established orthodoxy and to protect the vulnerable, the church recognizes and uses authority and authorization as the two sides of the same coin, which is recognized ministry. Any authority given to the leaders of the church is authority granted by the body politic for the preservation of orthodoxy and for the protection of its people. I do not mean to suggest that power offered cannot or has not been abused. We both know it can and it has. I do mean to suggest that in spite of that, and with the full awareness that abuses remain and will continue, the church as a body authorizes the use of power for the sake of its mission. It has long been the case that when that power or authority is abused, steps are taken to remedy the abuse and to preserve the church's equilibrium and effectiveness as an agent for the common good. Once authorized, the professional clergy of the church are granted permission to function in a variety of ways and settings to which few others in the church will ever be given access. They will baptize, confirm, marry, and bury. They will be given access to every week to a pulpit from which they will speak without restraint or interruption, saying whatever is on their heart or mind. They will enter hospital rooms and prison cells. They will be invited into homes and hear the confessions of husbands, wives, partners, sons, and daughters, and be asked to hold what they hear in strict confidence. They will be allowed to weigh in on life-changing decisions and sometimes even be given the option of making those decisions for others. When people are dying, they will be invited to witness the passing of a loved one. In the presence of death, it is they who will witness and heal grief. Hear the stories of the deceased and tell the story of the dead at a service commending them to God. In my second church, I had an elderly member named George who lived alone. He was a quiet and humble man who lived a very simple life. He showed up every Sunday in his denim overalls and his conductor's hat. He used to work for the railroads. One day, George ended up in the hospital. He would not leave it. He would drift into unconsciousness and not come out. Out of the blue, shortly after he went into the hospital, I got a call from a friend of mine who was a trusted attorney in town. He asked if George and I had talked. I told him that we had. He said he had something very specific he needed to ask me about. He was being very careful. As a lawyer, he knew full well about the privileged conversation and the need for us to respect confidences. He wanted to know if George had ever talked to me about dying, and I said he had. He wanted to know if George and I had ever talked about how he would feel about lingering hooked up to a machine. I told him we had. He wanted to know if I would be willing to go into court and testify to the content of those conversations and have the court authorize removing George from life support. I told him I would do that. I have often reflected on that moment in my ministry. I was the only one George had ever talked to about that. He hadn't even trusted his attorney with it. He never bothered to sign any documents and had slipped into a coma and couldn't testify to his own wishes on his own behalf. I have had conversations like that with many people over the years. This was the only time I ever had to go into a courtroom on a member's behalf and share their wishes in a court of law under oath to a judge. Given what is at stake, sufficient preparation and continuous oversight has been seen by the church as essential. Whatever hierarchy exists is owned collectively and willingly by the church, despite its oft-heard protestations to the contrary. It serves the common good. Postmoderns and the role of clergy. I am not so sure that the postmodern church is going to see this the same way. An inherent disdain towards and distrust of the established authority could produce a very different way of being church. I have to actually check myself at this point. My default language is to talk about being church. That is an indication of how embedded I am in my own paradigm. The truth is, postmoderns don't talk about building church or being church. That is not their version. I have tried to teach myself to stop referring to the postmodern church and to think instead of communities of faith or sustaining faith. A paradigm shift designed to create a new way to meet the needs of the faithful is emerging. It will prioritize a very different set of core values, standard practices and norms, and functional behaviors from its leaders. It will also look to build a model for sustaining the faith that establishes and oversees whatever they identify as leadership by very different methods. I'm going to take a bit of a detour here. I will try and establish the relevance of this detour shortly. I have already written that I believe the church exists for a purpose, mission. Leadership and discipleship, however we define them, are empowered for the sake of that mission. Mission doesn't emanate from and exist for the church. It is the church that emanates from and exists for mission. This is a greatly oversimplified ecclesiology that I am about to present, but let it suffice for now. My personal faith, my sense of call, and my understanding of the need for a church have become pretty simplified. I believe that every human being is a child of God, endowed with inherent worth and dignity and deserving of respect. I believe that God desires to relate to or to be in covenant with what God created, and that her need for right relationships results in a call to preserve the common good, or to borrow more biblical language, shalom. I believe that the law that was given was not a restrictive means by which humanity was to be controlled, judged, put to shame, and then either condemned or redeemed based on the strict adherence to it. I believe instead that the law is a prescriptive response to the question, how do human beings ever stand a chance of living together in harmony with one another? Well, says the lawgiver, don't steal from one another. Don't covet each other's property or spouse. Don't kill each other. Honor your parents. Love your God. You get the idea. I believe Jesus discovered an established power structure that used the law as a means of belittling, shaming, judging, and condemning. I believe he discovered some who used that power to engender fear. I believe he discovered some who, with that ability to engender fear and shame, took advantage of their power and made religion a very lucrative industry. I believe he rebelled against religion that was used as a means of some acquiring power, wealth, and prestige at the expense of others. Jesus was a corrective to all of that. He reminded us that the law could be summed up in this very simple formula: love your God with all your heart, soul, and mind and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. He ate with those whom the religious establishment of his time shamed. He gave them back some sense of honor, dignity, and worth. He recruited disciples who would learn to proclaim that same gospel and sent them into mission to all the ends of the earth to share the good news of God's love and acceptance. Here is what I believe. The church's mission, its purpose, and its reason for being is to be an agent of God's shalom. It exists so that people will come to understand and experience their fundamental value and worth. I believe that there are religious and non-religious people around the world engaged fully in that mission. Most of them would not in any way think of themselves as either related to the church or disciples of the one called Jesus. I believe that the church is living out its authentic call when it lives out its call to proclaim the good news of God's redeeming and transformative love. I believe that we do the best when our interest is not in conversion, membership, or active participation in the institutions we build and fund to undertake that mission. I believe that true conversion takes place and is sufficiently completed when a person learns to love themselves in such a way that they can come to love others more fully. I believe that any response on the part of the church is to organize itself to effectively undertake that mission is a good thing. I'm going to say one more thing about what I believe about the church and then return to my point about the role of clergy. Whether I believe this or simply observe it, I often experience the church as a body whose mission can appear to be to preserve itself. I know you can argue that to preserve an institution built to undertake a mission is a way of preserving the mission, but I don't experience those two as the same thing at all. What's more important, postmoderns don't experience that as the same thing either. As a partial remedy to this, I have taken to asking church governing boards to begin every meeting by giving everyone a chance to respond to one simple question. Since we last met, how has this church blessed you? It is a way of helping them to reclaim their missional grounding as a people of blessing. It is a way of reminding them that those who experience blessing can be a blessing to another. It is a way of inviting them to gather less to argue about how to handle to growing needs of an institutional body that needs money to run than to remind themselves of their call to be engaged in some kind of mission that transforms lives for the common good. So after all that, back to my point about the role of clergy. In order to organize its collective effort to proclaim the gospel to all the world, the church evolved into a highly organized, effectively maintained hierarchy that, at all levels, was built to ensure a faithful proclamation of the gospel. No one, myself included, can argue that this well-built machine failed on its grand and noble task. I stand utterly in awe of what this organization has built through the centuries. To be sure, there have been abuses. Those cannot be eliminated. All in all, what the church undertook and accomplished is nothing short of breathtaking. In small chapels, in hospital bedrooms, in prison cells, in war-torn villages and burgs, in underground railroads and the halls of Parliament and Congress, in hopes built to care for children with no home or family, in hospice centers, in domestic abuse shelters, in homeless centers, in sanctuaries both plain and ostentatious, on college campuses, in foxholes, in foreign lands, and to countless indigenous populations, the organizations that is the church was deployed to proclaim the love of God. Whether it could have done this with or without the institution it built is irrelevant. The The fact that it did build in order to undertake this mission on such a grand scale, and it worked. For many, it still does. For many others, it doesn't. Jesus changed a church whose upper management, enamored of its power and the prestige it afforded them, lost sight of its core missional calling. Postmoderns could very well be undertaking something very similar. Some see the church now as an institution that has grown too large for its own good. Some witness an abuse of power and authority and see it as endemic to the institution itself. Some experience the church as more invested in its perpetuation than its mission. Some feel that investing in a model of church that gives clergy centralized authority compromises a core value of the postmodern. The experts are already in the room. Not everyone feels this way about the church. There are still many for whom the church, as it is currently constructed, is exactly what they want and need. As long as that is the case, Church 2.0 will and should exist and do everything in its power to serve those people to the best of its ability. The question is whether or not postmodernity will need to create a new model in order for them to sustain the mission for which the church was called into being. Will a more mobile, a more adaptive, a more decentralized, a more flexible and less structured, a less institutionalized, a less organized model need to be birthed, grow, and flourish in an effort to recommit to the church to its call to transform lives for the common good? There are those who are already fully committed to this. They don't want, they don't need, nor do they seek the permission of the institutional church. They aren't all that interested in fighting the institution either. There is already a big assortment of somewhat isolated, but often very well-connected pockets all over the country who are living a very simple, very spiritual existence in a community of faith. They are motivated by both a personal desire to live a fulfilling and connected life, along with a corporate need to engage in work and mission that makes a difference in someone else's life. Later in the book, I will give some snapshots of a wide variety of these settings and what they are all about. For now, I want to say that they orient themselves towards authority very differently. Blame that on the postmoderns' hermeneutic of the suspicion towards its authority. Blame that on the postmoderns' need to have their experiences matter and their voices heard, not just in the process of democratizing the church and society, but in the actual educational process itself. To the extent that clergy are received as, perceived as, and or commissioned as authority figures, that is the extent to which the postmodern mind will be unable to accept them as a good investment in their effort to change the world or to live a meaningful life. I have already written about the fact that some of our churches are dying. I have written also about the likelihood that many of those churches are not going to be replaced with new ones. Some of the church's missional needs are going to be undertaken by a whole new breed of Christians. The next 3 chapters will attempt to describe that new breed. I have written about Church 2.0's experience of finding it more and more difficult to place our authorized clergy in full-time positions that guarantee them a sustainable life income. I have written about some conversations that leaders in Church 2.0 are having about whether or not we should continue to require seminary students to incur large debts without a promise of income on the other side of their authorization. This is all very real. I don't know what the figures are for other denominations, but I am guessing that they are comparable. In the United Church of Christ, there are 6 related seminaries. I was told about 10 years ago by one of the seminary presidents that it would take a minimum of 100 million in endowments to sustain the future life of any one of those seminaries. Some were well on their way to that figure, while the others were doing everything they could just to get there. I have been told by another seminary president that it costs UCC seminaries $48,000 per student per year. With tuition at $12,000 per year, that means our seminaries have to come up with $36,000 per student year. The last figure I was quoted told me that there are about 340 men and women currently engaged in active pursuit of their master's level education in the United Church of Christ. If we are going to engage system-wide in meaningful dialogue about the role of and continuing need for professional clergy as the most effective means of living out our missional calling, we have to have another serious conversation about missional resources. I wrote about this in chapter 3, that is, about the need for the church to collectively account for our shared missional resources. We also have to identify and own our shared missional needs. Are we wisely stewarding those assets for the sake of those needs? Such an assessment must, I argue, include the wisdom of a single denomination perpetuating 6 institutions of higher education that will require $144 million each to educate what is right now a total of 250 students. This discussion must include a deep objective analysis of the degree to which the church for the future is asking for a professional master's level authorized clergy whose oversight is maintained by another costly judicatory office. I am not arguing for or against the need for an educated clergy. I do see, though, that Church 3.0 is questioning that. I am not convinced that this is my role to tell them to stop. I have no doubt that whatever emerges to sustain faith through this paradigm shift, leadership of some kind will be called upon. Whatever shape that leadership takes, the faithful will ask certain things of them that requires skill, craft, and creativity. Church 2.0 is going to be around for a long time, and will continue to meet the needs of some who are still fed by this way of being church. It will continue to undertake the mission for which it was birthed. We will still need some of our institutions that were established to help this way of being church sustain itself, including clergy, seminaries to educate them, and judicatory bodies to oversee them in that ministry. I can't stress this enough, though. Whatever will be left of Church 2.0 will be compromised greatly if we do not have honest conversations about which of our current missional assets are needed to sustain institutions and judicatory offices at level more commensurate with actual membership totals. Do we need educated clergy? Yes, but it has become obvious to me and others that we can no longer afford all of the ones that we currently authorize. Do we need seminaries and institutions dedicated to the mission of fully preparing men and women to serve the church well? Yes, but it has become obvious to me and others that we can no longer afford all of the ones that currently exist. It will also be obvious to me that the mission of some of those seminaries will have to change dramatically in order for them to be relevant, fully prepared to meet the educational needs of those called to serve in a postmodern world. Do we need judicatory offices to authorize and maintain oversight of our church clergy? Yes, but it has become obvious to me that we can no longer afford all of the ones that we currently fund. Not only can we not afford them, what remains of Church 2.0 doesn't need all of them to sustain its mission. The leaders of Church 2.0 need to sit down as a covenant partners who care more about the collective missional calling of the church than the perpetuation of whatever is left of its institutional identity. If it doesn't, it will continue to fritter away the resources that have been asked to steward for the sake of its mission. Without the collective will do this. Without the collective will to do this for the collective will. Okay, there it is. Without the collective will to do this for the good of the whole right now, Church 2.0 is abandoning its future to a Darwin's test of the survival of the fittest. Some clergy will survive and keep their jobs and income, others will not. Many who don't will enter into their midlife trained for a call and a career that can no longer provide them with an income. Some seminaries will survive while others will be slowly forced to close. Some judicatory offices will remain, enough to meet the needs of a way of being church that I don't think is going to disappear, but will prove to be the choice over time of a fewer and fewer people. We begin with a mission. We ask ourselves what it will take to sustain that mission. Over time, the church has sought to rebuild itself when new movements emerge or paradigms shift. Some already experience the church of the present age to be an impediment to fully living out their call to faith. Because of that, we may be living through just such a time when the mission requires something new to sustain itself. In this new movement, there are deep questions being asked about the role of authority and authorization, the two sides of the same coin, that is professional clergy. For the sake of the mission, those questions need to be addressed by something more humane and mature than the simple living out of a Darwinian inevitability.
Wow. Lots going on there, but I do like, especially on page 85, when you talked about, when John Dorhauer talked about taking a moment at the beginning of meetings to talk about people having a chance to respond to the simple question, how has this church blessed you? We talk about, we open teams and meetings with prayers, but I think this in particular could bring it back to the blessing of mission. But I think we have to be mindful about asserting it that way. So,
I agree with you, because it's going to mean different things to different people.
right.
Yeah, and I think that that's exactly the essence of the move from 2.0 to 3.0 in a nutshell.
Right.
And we see it. I mean, not necessarily, well, yeah, we do see it in our own congregational dynamic, but I mean, in the business that I'm in, and I work in a judicatory office, you see those shifts. You see like congregations merging or yoking with one another and new covenants being drawn up. I'm looking forward to reading the next 3 chapters on what the mission of the postmodern looks like. Just kind of done a quick scan of things that are going around the city. And they have things like family fitness, and they have small meeting groups that get together during the week and talk about like a particular reading and how it has impacted their life, whether recently or during the week or something like that. And they engage on a much smaller level so that the faith sharing isn't all being delivered from the pulpit, which is kind of like what John spoke about in, was it the first chapter?
Right.
So yeah, I see that. And we've even seen it like with the UCC. The chapters in New England have all merged. That was just happening when Reverend Gallagher came to talk with us last fall.
Yeah.
So there's a significant consolidation, and pastors that want to maintain their calling as ministers, some of them are, making their own tents, so to speak, by becoming bivocational.
Right.
Yeah, they might become, some of them, whatever, like say if they started ministry after a career, they go back to that part-time. Might be nursing, it might be even an attorney, it might be in one case I know of a pharmacist, for example. So and then there of course are those that share a pastor between 2 congregations. A lot of tent makers, a lot of different things that are going on.
Right. When you look at the cost, what he has referred to, the cost of the 6 seminaries, the sheer cost of higher education in and of itself, but
Exactly.
the cost of the seminaries for that exclusive body of students who are looking for a higher education, when it comes down to it, if it's simply the lack of affordability, the congregation can't afford the pastor either.
Yeah.
And not only can't afford their salary, but can't afford to continue to fund the dwindling numbers of people who are going into seminary.
And when you hear about those student loans,
oh sure,
holy moly, So, yeah, there's got to be a shift, and I hope the heck we can get on the coattails of that shift.
Right. Looking ahead though, for next
Mhm.
Thursday, June 11th, chapter 6 has a cool lead-in sentence. He writes, "We should become more like McDonald's. By the end of this chapter, you will know what I mean by that." So,
Oh my, oh, that sounds like fun. Well, I'll look forward to seeing you next Thursday.
there
And
you
if I don't
go.
see you
Chapter
before
6.
then. Yeah. I'll see you in a half an hour out walking the dogs.
Probably. Have a good night.
You too, Kim. Thanks a lot. Be well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.